militarizing the police every single day.
This is it right here on our left. And SWAT's 1023. Got a vehicle in the driveway, man. Boys. Back up! Get him out! Get back! Get back!
Damning study shows billions spent militarizing the police do nothing to reduce violent crime. A Princeton University study concluded that militarizing police and SWAT teams provide no detectable benefits in terms of officer safety or violent crime reduction. By the Free Thought Project, September 2, 2018. There are always risks in challenging excessive police power, but the risks of not challenging it are more dangerous, even fatal. Hunter S. Thompson, Kingdom of Fear, Loathsome Secrets of a Star-Crossed Child in the Final Days of the American Century. The Rutherford Institute. I have known a lot of good cops, I have defended a lot of good cops, and I have been fortunate to call a number of good cops friends. So when I say that warrior cops hyped up on their own authority and the power of the badge have not made America any safer or freer, I am not disrespecting any of the fine, decent, lawful police officers who take seriously their oath of office to serve and protect their fellow citizens, uphold the Constitution, and maintain the peace. My beef is with the growing squads of warrior cops who have been given the green light to kill, shoot, taser, abuse and steal from American citizens in the so-called name of law and order. These cops are little more than vigilantes with a badge. Indeed, it is increasingly evident that militarized police armed with weapons of war who are allowed to operate above the law and break the laws with impunity have not made America any safer or freer. Don't take my word for it. A new study by a political scientist at Princeton University concludes that militarizing police and SWAT teams provide no detectable benefits in terms of officer safety or violent crime reduction. In fact, according to researcher Jonathan Momolo, if police in America are feeling less safe, it's because the process of transforming them into extensions of the military makes them less safe, less popular, and less trustworthy. The study, the first systematic analysis on the use and consequences of militarized force, reveals that police militarization neither reduces rates of violent crime nor changes the number of officers assaulted or killed. In other words, warrior cops aren't making us or themselves any safer. Consider that not a day goes by without reports of police officers overstepping the bounds of the Constitution and brutalizing, terrorizing, and killing the citizenry. Indeed, the list of incidents in which unaccountable police abuse their power, betray their oath of office and leave taxpayers bruised, broken, and slashed or killed grows longer and more tragic by the day. Americans are now 8 times more likely to die in a police confrontation than they are to be killed by a terrorist. The problem, as one reporter rightly concluded, is not that life has gotten that much more dangerous, it's that authorities have chosen to respond to even innocent situations as if they were in a war zone. This battlefield mindset has gone hand in hand with the rise of militarized SWAT, special weapons and tactics, teams. Frequently justified as vital tools necessary to combat terrorism and deal with rare but extremely dangerous criminal situations, such as those involving hostages, SWAT teams which first appeared on the scene in California in the 1960s have now become intrinsic parts of local law enforcement operations, thanks in large part to substantial federal assistance and the Pentagon's military surplus recycling program, which allows the transfer of military equipment, weapons, and training to local police for free or at sharp discounts. Ponder this: in 1980, there were roughly 3,000 SWAT team-style raids in the U.S. Incredibly, that number has since grown to more than 80,000 SWAT team raids per year. There are few communities without a SWAT team today. Where this becomes a problem of life and death for Americans is when these SWAT teams, dressed, armed, and trained in military tactics, are assigned to carry out routine law enforcement tasks, such as serving a search warrant. No longer reserved exclusively for deadly situations, SWAT teams are now increasingly being deployed for relatively routine police matters, with some SWAT teams being sent out as much as 5 times a day. In the state of Maryland alone, 92% of 8,200 SWAT missions were used to execute search or arrest warrants. For example, police in both Baltimore and Dallas have used SWAT teams to bust up poker games. A Connecticut SWAT team swarmed a bar suspected of serving alcohol to underage individuals. In Arizona, a SWAT team was used to break up an alleged cockfighting ring. An Atlanta SWAT team raided a music studio, allegedly out of a concern that it might have been involved in illegal music piracy. A Minnesota SWAT team raided the wrong house in the middle of the night, handcuffed the 3 young children, held the mother on the floor at gunpoint, shot the family dog, and then forced the handcuffed children to sit next to the carcass of their dead pet and bloody pet for more than an hour while they searched the home. A California SWAT team drove an armored Lenco Bearcat into Roger Serrato's yard, surrounded his home with paramilitary troops wearing face masks, threw a fire-starting flashbang grenade into the house in order, then when Serrato appeared at a window, unarmed and wearing only his shorts, held him at bay with rifles. Serrato died of asphyxiation from being trapped in the flame-filled house. Incredibly, the father of 4 had done nothing wrong. The SWAT team had misidentified him as someone involved in a shooting. And then there was the police officer who tripped and accidentally shot and killed Yuri Stamps, an unarmed grandfather of 12, who had been forced to lie face down on the floor of his home at gunpoint while a SWAT team attempted to execute a search warrant against his stepson. Equally outrageous was the 4-hour SWAT team raid on a California high school, where students were locked down in classrooms, forced to urinate in overturned desks and generally terrorized by heavily armed, masked gunmen searching for possible weapons that were never found. These incidents are just the tip of the iceberg. Nationwide, SWAT teams have been employed to address an astonishingly trivial array of criminal activity or mere community nuisances: angry dogs, domestic disputes, improper paperwork filed by an orchid farmer, and misdemeanor marijuana possession, to give a brief sampling. If these raids are becoming increasingly common and widespread, you can chalk it up to the make-work philosophy, in which you assign at times unnecessary jobs to individuals to keep them busy or employed. In this case, however, the make-work principle is being used to justify the use of sophisticated military equipment and, in the process, qualify for federal funding. Remember, SWAT teams originated as specialized units dedicated to defusing extremely sensitive, dangerous situations. They were never meant to be used for routine police work such as serving a warrant. As the role of paramilitary forces has expanded, however, to include involvement in nondescript police work targeting nonviolent suspects, the mere presence of SWAT units has actually injected a level of danger and violence into police-citizen interactions that was not present as long as these interactions were handled by traditional civilian officers. What we are witnessing is an inversion of the police-civilian relationship. Rather than compelling police officers to remain within constitutional bounds as servants of the people, ordinary Americans are being placed at the mercy of militarized police units. This is what happens when paramilitary forces are used to conduct ordinary policing operations, such as executing warrants on nonviolent defendants. Moreover, general incompetence, collateral damage, fatalities, property damage, etc., and botched raids tend to go hand in hand with an overuse of paramilitary forces. In some cases, officers misread the address on the warrant. In others, they simply barge into the wrong house or even the wrong building. In another subset of cases, such as the Department of Education raid on Anthony Wright's home, police conduct a search of a building where the suspect no longer resides. SWAT teams have even on occasion conducted multiple, sequential raids on wrong addresses or executed search warrants despite the fact that the suspect is already in police custody. Police have also raided homes on the basis of mistaking the presence or scent of legal substances for drugs. Incredibly, these substances have included tomatoes, sunflowers, fish, elderberry bushes, KENNETH plants, hibiscus, and ragweed. As you can see, all too often, botched SWAT team raids have resulted in one tragedy after another for the residents with little consequences for law enforcement. Unfortunately, judges tend to afford extreme levels of deference to police officers who have mistakenly killed innocent civilians but do not afford similar leniency to civilians who have injured police officers in acts of self-defense. Even homeowners who mistake officers for robbers can be sentenced for assault or murder if they take defensive actions resulting in harm to police. And as journalist Radley Balko shows in his in-depth study of police militarization, the shock and awe tactics utilized by many SWAT teams only increases the likelihood that someone will get hurt. Drug warrants, for instance, are typically served by paramilitary units late at night or shortly before dawn. Unfortunately, to the unsuspecting homeowner, especially in cases involving mistaken identities or wrong addresses, a raid can appear to be nothing less than a violent home invasion, with armed intruders crashing through their door. The natural reaction would be to engage in self-defense. Yet such a defensive reaction on the part of a homeowner, particularly a gun owner, will spur officers to employ lethal force. That's exactly what happened to Jose Guarina, the young ex-Marine who was killed after a SWAT team kicked open the door of his Arizona home during a drug raid and opened fire. According to news reports, Guarina, 26 years old and the father of 2 young children, grabbed a gun in response to the forced invasion but never fired. In fact, the safety was still on his gun when he was killed. Police officers were not as restrained. The young Iraqi war veteran was allegedly fired upon 71 times. Guarina had no prior criminal record, and the police found nothing illegal in his home. The problems inherent in these situations are further compounded by the fact that SWAT teams are granted no-knock warrants at high rates such that the warrants themselves are rendered practically meaningless. This sorry state of affairs is made even worse by U.S. Supreme Court rulings that have essentially done away with the need for a no-knock warrant altogether, giving the police authority to disregard the protections afforded American citizens by the Fourth Amendment. In the process, Americans are rendered altogether helpless and terror-stricken as a result of these confrontations with the police. Indeed, terrorizing is a mild term to describe the effect on those who survive such vigilante tactics. It was terrible. It was the most frightening experience of my life. I thought it was a terrorist attack, said 84-year-old Leona Goldberg, a victim of such a raid. Yet this type of terrorizing activity is characteristic of the culture that we have created. If ever there were a time to demilitarize and de-weaponize local police forces, it's now. While we are now grappling with a power-hungry police state at the federal level, the militarization of domestic American law enforcement is largely the result of the militarization of local police forces, which are increasingly militaristic in their uniforms, weaponry, language, training, and tactics, and have come to rely on SWAT teams in matters that once could have been satisfactorily performed by traditional civilian officers. Yet American police forces were never supposed to be a branch of the military, nor were they meant to be private security forces for the reigning political faction. Instead, they were intended to be an aggregation of countless local police units, composed of citizens like you and me that exist for a sole purpose, to serve and protect the citizens of each and every American community. As a result of the increasing militarization of the police in recent years, however, the police now not only look like the military with their foreboding uniforms and phalanx of lethal weapons, but they function like them, as well. Thus, no more do we have a civilian force of peace officers entrusted with serving and protecting the American people. Instead, today's militarized law enforcement officials have shifted their allegiance from the citizenry to the state, acting preemptively to ward off any possible challenges to the government's power, unrestrained by the boundaries of the Fourth Amendment. As journalist Herman Schwartz observed, the Fourth Amendment was designed to stand between us and arbitrary governmental authority. For all practical purposes, that shield has been shattered, leaving our liberty and personal integrity subject to the whim of every cop on the beat, trooper on the highway and jail official. Armed police officers, the end product of the government federal, local and state and law enforcement agencies having merged, have become a standing or permanent army, composed of full-time professional soldiers who do not disband. Yet these permanent armies are exactly what those who drafted the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights feared as tools used by despotic governments to wage war against its citizens. This phenomenon we are experiencing with the police is what philosopher Abraham Kaplan referred to as the law of the instrument, which essentially says that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In the scenario that has been playing out in recent years, we the citizenry have become the nails to be hammered by the government's henchmen, aka its guns for hire, aka its standing army, aka the nation's law enforcement agencies. Yet the tension inherent in most civilian police encounter these days can't be blamed exclusively on law enforcement's growing reliance on SWAT teams and donated military equipment. It goes far deeper, to a transformation in the way police view themselves and their line of duty. Specifically, what we're dealing with today is a skewed shoot-to-kill mindset in which police, trained to view themselves as warriors or soldiers in a war, whether against drugs, or terror, or crime, must get the bad guys, i.e., anyone who is a potential target before the bad guys get them. The result is a spike in the number of incidents in which police shoot first, and ask questions later. Making matters worse, when these officers, who have long since ceased to be peace officers, violate their oaths by bullying, beating, tasering, shooting and killing their employers, the taxpayers to whom they owe their allegiance, they are rarely given more than a slap on the hands before resuming their patrols. As I document in my book Battlefield America, The War on the American People, this lawlessness on the part of law enforcement, an unmistakable characteristic of a police state, is made possible in large part by police unions which routinely oppose civilian review boards and resist the placement of names and badge numbers on officer uniforms, police agencies that abide by the Blue Code of Silence, the quiet understanding among police that they should not implicate their colleagues for their crimes and misconduct, prosecutors who treat police offenses with greater leniency than civilian offenses, courts that sanction police wrongdoing in the name of security, and legislatures that enhance the power, reach and arsenal of the police, and a citizenry that fails to hold its government accountable to the rule of law. Clearly, it's time for a reality check, for both the police and the citizens of this nation. About John W. Whitehead. Constitutional attorney and author John W. Whitehead is founder and president of the Rutherford Institute. His new book Battlefield America, The War on the American People, Select Books, 2015, is available online at www.amazon.com. Whitehead can be contacted at johnw@rutherford.org.
In Vanessa's mind,
You, one of the proud, but the family of Marine Jose Guareno want more than just a few answers, and they want his own children to continue to be proud of their dad.
He keeps asking that. Is he a bad guy?
Wife Vanessa told us that's the only thing on her son's mind since last Thursday's SWAT shooting. SWAT was executing a search warrant for drugs. The Guarenas insist SWAT found nothing in the home. The family hired criminal defense attorney Christopher Salepi, and he told us restoring the Marines' good name is mission number one.
one of the first and foremost things in Vanessa's mind, his wife's mind, is to clear his name and to clear his name with the community and also with his own children who saw the remnants of what happened.
SWAT said Guarena pointed a gun at them before sheriff's deputies admitted to firing 71 rounds the Marines' way in just 7 seconds. After the gunfire, wife Vanessa emerged from a closet she was hiding in. She told us she heard her husband still moaning.
I was going to touch Jose because he was saying that, and he was, and I saw his stomach, and I saw all the blood on the floor, so they came into my house and they get me.
Vanessa was rushed from the home, but she had one request.
The only thing that I told him, take care of him, take him to the hospital.
But now KGUN 9 has uncovered that it took 1 hour and 14 minutes for that to happen.
From the time paramedics arrived on scene until they were allowed in the home, it was 1 hour and 14 minutes. In the case of the Gabby Gifford shooting, 12 minutes. Do you plan to investigate that? What do you think of that time discrepancy?
We're going to be investigating every and all aspects of this case.
Is that something that particularly concerns you, though?
It's a concern. It's a concern.
On the line by John Fassman, our correspondent in London, this is The Economist. When criminals are heavily armed, the police understandably want to be heavily armed too to protect themselves. But there's been a huge rise in the number of SWAT raids in recent years, and some say it's gone too far. I'm Robert Guest, The Economist's US editor, and I'm joined on the line by John Fassman, our correspondent in Atlanta. John, can you explain to our foreign listeners exactly what a SWAT team is?
SWAT stands for Special Weapons and Tactics, and it refers to paramilitary units of police forces. These are policemen who carry military-grade weapons, assault rifles and things like that, often travel in armored personnel carriers. And it was created, the first SWAT team was created in Los Angeles in the late 1960s to respond to violent civil unrest. And the idea was that police needed a unit that could respond to situations, hostage situations, people barricaded in buildings, that could respond with overwhelming force. The problem is that you've gone from having a few hundred raids a year in the 1970s to about 100 a day. And most of these are not in response to life-threatening situations. Most of these are drug warrants being served on private residences.
So you mean it's not that the suspected criminal in the house has threatened to kill anyone or is known to be violent, but simply that the police wish to serve a warrant on him and they choose to do it by sending in a heavily armed SWAT team. Is that right?
Right. You have a warrant that says, you know, this person may have a half dozen marijuana plants in his basement. And so instead of sending 2 or 4 police officers, you send a 16-person SWAT team in an armored personnel carrier. And they serve the warrants usually very early in the morning. Often they'll bang down the door and throw in a flashbang grenade, which is designed to blind and deafen the people inside. Radley Balco, who has released a book on police militarization called Rise of the Warrior Cop, has counted 50 innocent people killed in botched SWAT raids.
Apart from serving drug warrants, what else are these SWAT raids used for?
Well, there's been a tremendous amount of mission creep. Police in Baltimore, Dallas, and South Carolina have all used SWAT units to break up poker games because the poker games are illegal. In 2006, immigration police wearing full riot gear and heavily armed arrested 6 Tibetan Buddhist monks in Nebraska who had overstayed their visa. In 2011, heavily armed police raided barbershops near Orlando, Florida, and arrested 34 people for barbering without licenses. SWAT teams have been sent to raid bars suspected of serving alcohol to underage patrons. And in Arlington, Texas, they were sent essentially to enforce code compliance on an organic farm that had left messy stuff in their yard.
That's incredible. What's causing this mission creep? Why have SWAT tactics spread so far from their original purpose?
Let's first establish they have not spread in response to a rise in crime. They have ballooned between 1980 and 2007, and during that time, violent crime has fallen in the United States. The reason they seem to have risen is simply because there are more SWAT teams now than there were. Now a majority, not only of big cities have SWAT teams, but a majority of towns with populations under 50,000 have their own SWAT teams or are part of a sort of joint municipal SWAT force that exists in their area and can be called out.
Has the enormous rise in spending on homeland security since 9/11 played a role?
Yes. Senator Tom Coburn from Oklahoma released a report in 2012 that said that between 2001 and 2011, the Department of Homeland Security has spent over $35 billion on grants to state and local police departments.
And what's the money been spent on?
Well, it's been spent on a lot of things. It's been spent on, body armor. It's been spent on computers. It's been spent on technical equipment. A lot of it has been spent on weapons and military-type toys. of really dubious need. There's a town in New Hampshire called Keene, which has averaged fewer than 2 homicides a year going back to the early 90s. And they spent $285,000 on a Bearcat, which is an armored personnel carrier with a turret that their police chief said they needed to guard their pumpkin festival and other dangerous events.
I remember interviewing a policeman once who had been head of a SWAT team, and he told me that his time running a SWAT team was the most enjoyable time of his life. And while obviously one would like people to enjoy their jobs, this did strike me as a little bit worrying. SWAT tactics are the sorts of things that one would hope are being used in extreme circumstances, not just because they're fun. How much oversight is there over the expansion of SWAT tactics?
There's no national reporting requirement. There are certain states that have started doing some very promising things. In 2009, Maryland's Governor Martin O'Malley signed into law a bill requiring police departments in the state to report twice a year on SWAT deployments, and they have to report how often they were deployed and for what reasons. Now, the hope behind this bill, I think, was that as people saw how often SWAT teams were deployed and for what reason, that there would be public pressure to bring down the number of deployments and to really get back to the original mission of SWAT. Unfortunately, so far that has not been the case. The numbers have stayed pretty steady. The important thing to remember is that this is not an argument that SWAT should be disbanded or that police shouldn't have SWAT teams. Police need SWAT teams. When there is a life-threatening situation, you want police to be able to guard the public and to be able to go in with overwhelming force. But you also want individual police departments to think very carefully about what the mission of police is. And the concern is that as police sort of tend to get more militarized, policemen start behaving more like soldiers. And you've got to remember that the mission of those two groups are completely different. The mission of a police officer is to protect and serve the community in which he, I hope, lives, or at least lives near. The mission of a soldier going into battle is to annihilate an enemy. And the more police act like soldiers, the worse it is for American civil liberties.
Thanks very much, John. That was John Fassman, our Atlanta correspondent.
The more people know about what's going on, the angrier they are about it.
Hi, I'm Mike Riggs with Reason TV, and I'm here today with Radley Balco, author of Rise of the Warrior Cop. Radley's also an alumnus of Reason Magazine and an investigative reporter with the Huffington Post. Radley, good to have you here today.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So, what is the Warrior Cop? Where did it come from?
Well, the Warrior Cop is basically this idea that police have become more militarized, more soldier-like in the last probably generation or two. And it applies, to the weapons that they're using, to the uniforms that they wear, which have switched from sort of the police blues to these battle dress uniforms, which mimic military uniforms, to the tactics they use, to what I think is the most kind of pervasive problem, which is the mindset that police officers take to the job. And this has been fostered by a number of policies, some of which didn't necessarily intend this to be the outcome. But also just a lot of war and sort of martial rhetoric from politicians over the years that has also sort of nudged this trend to where we are today.
So you put the birthplace of the SWAT team, which is a big part of police militarization, Los Angeles, the LAPD, the brainchild of Daryl Gates, who worked for the LAPD, and it was a response to the Watts riots in 1965, the clock tower shooting in Austin with Charles Whitman, and at the time you you don't criticize Gates for this. You're saying maybe it was sensible at the time to say police, as we knew them in 1965, were not actually prepared for situations of urban violence with shooters in buildings and that kind of thing. So at what point would you say that the SWAT team went from this idea to be used like very selectively in very certain, very violent situations? When did it become this thing that was normal to use wherever, whenever?
So I think there are two trends that were going on in the late 60s and early 70s. One was, as you mentioned, this rise of the SWAT team that started in LA, and after two really high-profile incidents, one with the Black Panthers and one with the Symbionese Liberation Army, both of these raids were televised, got the SWAT a lot of publicity, it started spreading to other cities. And so, we go from one SWAT team in about 1970 to about 500 by 1975. But throughout the 70s, the SWAT teams were used in these emergency type situations. So again, riots and hostage takings and bank robberies. And they were used in situations where the government was using violence to diffuse an already violent situation, right, where lives were immediately at risk. At the same time, you have this other trend, which is Nixon's drug war. So Nixon declares war on drugs, starts really kind of amping up the battlefield rhetoric with respect to drugs. He pushes the no-knock raid through Congress, which was actually the brainchild of a 29-year-old Senate aide. It wasn't something that police chiefs were demanding. It wasn't something criminologists were saying was necessary. This was a political ploy, basically. But both of these trends are sort of moving parallel until the 1980s, and it's really during the Reagan administration that we see them converge, and this is where we start to see SWAT teams used to serve warrants on people suspected of nonviolent consensual drug crimes. And here, now SWAT teams are actually creating violence where there was none before. And this is where I think, the trend really starts to become problematic.
We've got to a point where we've gone from hostage situations, armed shooters, this kind of stuff, to police creating violence where there was none. And it's largely because of Nixon dehumanizing drug users, drug dealers. And then things there becomes a moment where we pause and say, wait a minute, is this a good idea? I mean, when does this happen?
So, so Nixon declares war on drugs. He pushes through the no-knock raid bill through Congress. And what happens, a couple things happen. So Congress passed two bills. One that applied to federal narcotics agents doing federal investigations anywhere in the country. The other bill applied only to the DC Police Department because Congress has jurisdiction over DC. So what was fascinating is there are two different reactions. In DC, the police chief at the time, Jerry Wilson, was a very kind of forward-thinking police chief, took a very less reactionary approach to crime. And he actually refused to implement the no-knock law. He said it wasn't necessary. He said, there was no need to barge into people's homes like this. And oddly enough, crime actually went down in DC over the next few years while it went up in the rest of the country. At the federal level, things were very different. You had these narcotics agents who made full use of this law, and they were, raiding homes left and right. They were raiding homes without warrants. They were, terrorizing innocent people. But these weren't SWAT teams. These were narcotics cops in street clothes, basically undercover cops, and they were kicking down doors. And what happened was there were a few raids that really started to pick up some national attention. And Congress actually shows some remorse and shame. They hold hearings, they bring victims in to testify, and they actually end up repealing both no-knock laws. And not only that, they pass another law making the federal government liable anytime a federal agent commits a raid on the wrong house. So it was this rare moment where the drug war was still sort of intractable, or wasn't completely intractable. Congress could actually admit it made a mistake and gone a little bit too far and actually rein things in a little bit. That's unfortunately pretty much the last time that would happen.
So that's our last bright spot. And that's not even being cynical or hyperbolic. I mean, really between then and now, that's the last time anybody's going to say, maybe let's slow down.
Well, I mean, the Carter administration really kind of put a brake on all of this as well. But then, unfortunately, as Carter left office, there were a bunch of scandals where, it was rumored that his own drug czar had done cocaine at a normal party. And so the Reagan people come in and they really kind of use the negative publicity from the Carter administration's sort of lax attitude toward drugs to really kind of fill all these positions with moralists and, people who took a very kind of it's just about right and wrong sort of approach to the war on drugs. And this is where we really see the both the rhetoric and the policy start to escalate.
Now we see SWAT teams raiding small, friendly poker games you've talked about. There was, I think, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, the Department of Education used a SWAT team to raid the home of a couple who had maybe used some sort of mail fraud to get student loans they didn't need.
Yeah.
Which obviously, against the law, but does it require a SWAT team?
Yeah.
What happens that we go from SWAT teams for drug houses to raiding poker games at people's homes, to raiding people who had maybe done mail fraud or something?
I think there are a couple periods where we kind of enter new ground in this issue. The first is in 1996 when California legalizes medical marijuana. And up until that point, the justification for using these kinds of heavy-handed tactics was always that drug dealers are terrible people, they're dangerous, they're heavily armed, they're career criminals, they wouldn't think twice before taking out a cop. And a lot of that wasn't true. There were counter arguments to all those points, but at least they were making the argument, right? They were saying we need this amount of force because of this threat we're facing is significant, and we need to protect officer safety. once California legalized medical marijuana and the federal government now starts sending SWAT teams in to raid these dispensaries, that justification goes out the window, right? I mean, these are businesses that are openly operating. They have business licenses. They're operating in compliance with state law. I mean, nobody can seriously argue that the, hippie mom and pop couple who run the pot dispensary are a threat to, pull an AR-15 out from under the counter and kill a bunch of federal agents. This was about sending a political message. These people were openly flouting federal law, and so we had to bring the boot down on them to make an example of them. And this is really sort of terrifying territory that we enter in the 1990s, and of course it's still going on today. This is government using violence to send a political message, and that's not something we normally associate with free societies. The next sort of frontier, I think, there wasn't sort of a make or break moment when it happened, but I think just in the last probably 7 or 8 years, we've really seen SWAT mission creep grow beyond the drug war. And now, as you said, we're seeing these raids on poker games, particularly when the Texas Hold'em craze started taking off in the mid-2000s. We saw SWAT teams breaking up neighborhood poker games at bars that were openly advertised, were raided with SWAT teams. Reason TV did a story about the VFW hall in Dallas that was raided by a SWAT team because they were conducting charity poker games. And here's where we really start to see the mission creep and SWAT sort of looking for new reasons to use this sort of force. There's the old saying, when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And I think really in the last decade, that's really where we've seen this happen. And now we're out to the point where we're seeing SWAT raids for regulatory inspections. It's now become sort of an end around the Fourth Amendment. There have been lots of raids on bars where, it was basically just a drug sweep, but the police brought somebody from the alcohol inspection board to come with them, and now it's, officially an alcohol inspection. We're just making sure your liquor's properly labeled,
Sure.
But we're going to go ahead and point our guns at all your customers and search them.
Your book, up until the very end, where you get to the sort of reform section, by the time you get to the reform section, actually even in the beginning of the reform section, which is about the story of Che Calvo, the mayor of Berwyn Heights in Maryland, you feel hopeless.
Yeah.
You feel like this is intractable. Nevertheless, you do have some suggestions for reform. You list, accountability, transparency, changing police culture. What are the most important ones? Which ones do you really? Because every reformer has a wish list, and it includes some starry-eyed stuff. What's the stuff that you really think would work?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, the stuff that would be most effective is the stuff that's least likely to happen. So yeah, ending the drug war, reining SWAT in to only serve warrants in these. I mean, if I could write a rule, and I'm not anti-SWAT team, I do think there's an appropriate use for them. If I could write a rule, it would be that SWAT teams should only be used when an act of violence is being committed or about to be committed, actual violence, right? That would be a great rule. It's never going to pass because sending SWAT teams out on drug raids is financially, it brings revenue into police departments through federal grants and asset forfeiture. But that would be a great rule. But also, I mean, part of it is just building up the will for reform. And what I found, and actually this is encouraging in an otherwise pretty cynical book, the more people know about what's going on, the angrier they are about it. And I talk about this raid in Columbia, Missouri that was recorded a few years ago and posted online. And this was a very standard raid. I mean, it was just like every other one of these drug raids, but it was it's extraordinarily violent. They shoot the dog. There's a kid in the house they didn't know about. They come in shooting and screaming and with all their guns. And what was amazing is it gets posted online, and the reaction was just, the video goes viral, and the reaction was just outrage. I mean, the police department, their phone lines were shut down, their email got shut down because they were overwhelmed. They got death threats. And it was almost as if, it was actually like, the internet generation for the first time was seeing how the drug war was actually fought on the ground, and they were very, very angry by what they saw. And I think, just transparency will do a lot. I mean, I think if we can just get word out about what's happening, then I think we can build up the will for some reform. So I think all these raids should be recorded, and those videos should be subject to FOIA and open records requests.
Well, Radley, thank you for being here today, for talking about your book, Rise of the Warrior Cop.
Thanks for having me on.
For Reason TV, I'm Mike Rigg.
Police use who may want to retaliate against him physically.
Hey Charlotte County, this is Charlotte County Cop Watch, and I just wanted you to know that I am using this stuff under fair use, and also remember to like and subscribe this channel. Also too, keep in mind, I do not make any money on YouTube. This is 5 hours work a day, you know, fighting for freedom. And you can donate with PayPal and Patreon. I just want you to think about this. If everybody gives to PayPal and Patreon, Patreon is every month. Actually, PayPal you can do every month. I have 12,000 subscribers. If everybody gives, I can quit my regular job and go full-time investigations on Charlotte County and possibly even more and beyond. So just keep that in mind. If everybody helps out, I can go full-time doing this. Thanks.